I'm going to first introduce our moderator for the keynote, John Knubley. He's actually a former colleague of mine and good friend. He's the Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development in the Government of Canada. That's a big mouthful, and it shows the breadth of his portfolio and the responsibilities of his minister and that he has, that includes everything in science and technology, industrial policy, all the regional economic development efforts, etc. And he's also, within his ministry, one of his key priorities right now, and for the government with his minister, is the innovation agenda, which is joined at the hip, I think it's fair to say, with the skills and learning agenda that Louise Livonian, who was here with us this morning. So, and I think what's distinctive about this agenda, and it's written up in John's bio, is that it's intended to be a whole of government effort, but also an inclusive agenda. So it's about growth and competitiveness, and it's also about inclusion and sustainability. So John's, it's important actually that we have at a social policy conference a senior deputy minister who's coming to us from the innovation and the industry and the economic development side. He's one of the most senior deputies in Ottawa. He's served in many different capacities and many portfolios, mostly on the economic side, but I also know that he had a stint in social policy and cares a great deal about it. He's had a distinctive career, and he has a fairly distinguished educational background too, with some important degrees from some important universities. So I'm going to let John. That's enough, Margaret. So John's going to introduce our guest.
So thank you, Margaret, and it's great to be here. At one point, as Margaret mentioned, in my career, we worked very closely together on social policy, and we would regularly come to Queens to conferences like this one, and it's great to see that these kinds of conferences are still alive and well, and of course, this one is particularly on the theme of the day, the workplace of the future and the work activities of the future. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Darrell West, who's Vice President and Director, Governance Studies and Founding Director, Center for Technology Innovation, Brookings Institute, Washington, D.C. And if you saw his biography, he also spent a quarter century at Brown. He told me earlier that he left Brown hoping to find a place in Washington where it was more relevant, I think that was the word, and tied into the work of the administration. He admitted that under the Trump administration, maybe it was a little too relevant and too close. So I'm glad to hear him say that. I did have the opportunity actually of meeting Darrell a couple of months ago when I was in Washington, and it was just at the point that his book, The Future of Work, Robots, AI, and Automation was being released. And just a couple of comments from me as way of introduction in terms of our conversation at that point. One thing that's in the book, and I certainly experienced this as Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, is, while it's true these disruptive technologies will be in the future, they're already here. I mean, I spent the day touring parts of Queens, some of the startup companies, incubators. They are already working in AI. They are already doing robotics. They are already doing precision agriculture and precision medicine. 5G is going to change, I think, the opportunity set here and even move the pace faster. However, the one thing I think about workplace for the future is here now, and we really need to be responsive and agile quickly. The other thing I recall spending some time talking to Darrell about was the actual education system and what needs to be done to change the education system in the United States and in Canada, which are somewhat different, but nevertheless face the same challenges of how do you prepare people for really a continuous learning experience where disruptive technologies are changing the skill sets required in various businesses. And the image of one person staying in one job with a specific skill set, if that ever existed, is really no longer the case. And what do we need to do from a social support perspective to actually address those issues. And I'm sure Darrell's going to speak to a number of the opportunities there. And there are many of these issues like lifelong learning and a more applied education system using the colleges and universities more as a unit that we've talked about in Canada, but the time is now. We actually have to do this. And I don't know, I've been talking lifelong learning since I think I joined the public service. I won't tell you how many years ago, but I don't think we've nailed that one. Another element that we talked about was digital skills and how important digital skills are in the current context. And in the book, again, this is really, I think, an important theme. That is something that as an innovation department, we've actually focused on. And to digress a little bit, one of the things I've found different than doing an innovation agenda this time around, as opposed to 10 years ago or 15 years ago, is when you sit down with businesses, the first thing they start to talk about is in the context of disruptive technologies, what will the business model be? And most importantly, what will the people be that they need to do this? And there's a lot of anxiety, not only about the workers, but also among the businesses about what people they need to be successful in the future. The last point I'm going to make is probably my own point, and I'm not sure I did raise this with Darrell, but there was a G7 conference earlier this year, which was kind of interesting insofar as it had ministers of employment and ministers of innovation and science and research and development. They met separately, but then they came together. The one thing I just want to emphasize from the innovation side is there's no way you can stop innovation. And the real issue is how do you find opportunities in all of these changes of disruptive technologies and promote the development of a workforce that will really support Canada finding its way and its successes in terms of the innovation that's going to hit us. So those are some of my thoughts, and I know the book that Darrell has written and some of the previous work that he's done, I think fit into these themes, and he told me he wouldn't contradict me, so I'm counting on that.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here at Queen's University. And I have to say, it's great to be out of Washington, D.C. as well. As John was alluding, it is a bit of a turbulent time in the United States. There's a lot of talk about building walls and pitting group against a group. And you know, if this continues, Canada may have to build a wall to keep the Americans out. But I did drive down this afternoon from Ottawa, and I have to say it was a real pleasure to drive in Canada because people actually use their turn signals and their blinkers on their cars. This is rare in the United States because we want to keep people off guard about our ultimate intentions. Thank you. Well, I guess we should just move to the Q&A period right now. So. But I understand from Margaret and others you had terrific conversations today, covered some of the latest trends in technology innovation and workforce development. I'm not surprised at the interest in these topics because everybody all around the world is thinking about these emerging trends and wondering how technology is going to affect them and their children. And John mentioned my book, The Future of Work, that came out a couple months ago. What I argue in the book is that the technology revolution is going to be accelerating in the next few years. In fact, I think people are actually going to be shocked how quickly a lot of changes take place. So just as an example, in terms of autonomous vehicles, Uber in the United States already has ordered 24,000 vehicles with delivery starting next year. So we're not talking about some futuristic vision where 5 or 10 years down the road we're going to see fully autonomous vehicles. In certain American cities, we're going to start seeing them on the road next year. Robots are coming down in price and they're becoming more common in the workplace. AI is being deployed in finance, healthcare, and education. And John mentioned here at Queens, there are AI applications that are being developed as well. I think one of the largest sectors that's going to be affected by these emerging technologies will be the retail sector. In the United States, we're already seeing self-checkout lines. Amazon is experimenting with stores without clerks, meaning they monitor the items that you put in your shopping cart and automatically charge you, so you can walk out of that store without dealing with any human being. Amazon just purchased Whole Foods, and both Amazon and Walmart are now providing curbside pickup of online orders. So for example, you could order groceries online, go to the store, 30 or 60 minutes later, they can kind of track you via a GPS and know when your car is pulling into the parking lot and somebody walks out and puts the groceries in your car. I've been to restaurants where when you walk in, they hand you a tablet and you order from that device as opposed to from a waiter or waitress. So I think all of these developments are going to add up. 5G certainly is going to be a major help in that regard. Every time you build a smarter and faster platform, there will be new applications that take advantage of that. Of course, there's a lot of disagreement over the scope of the workforce impact. I've read a number of different studies which range anywhere from a 10 to a 50% impact. The study that I think is most persuasive was undertaken by McKinsey, which found that only 5% of occupations could be fully automated. But then they also noted that 30% of the activities in 60% of the jobs can be automated. So I think a lot of the debate over how much automation is going to affect the workforce really comes down to at what point do businesses replace humans with various new technologies. You know, if the machine can do 30% of your job, probably not, but then as that automation comes in and can do 50% of your job, 60%, and 70%, then the calculus starts to shift. In Canada, I know Learning Nation put out a report that estimated 10% of the jobs here will be automated. But sometimes I think we're focusing too much on the job because we're also going to see a big impact in terms of incomes and benefits. The risk is that we may be moving into an environment where there's a big impact in terms of lowering incomes, creating more temporary jobs, and having more economic insecurity. Because it's not just the technology revolution that we should be thinking about, there also are major changes in business models. And it's really the combination of the technology and the changing business models that has the potential to produce the economic insecurity. You know, the rise of the gig economy, the sharing economy, oftentimes that means temporary workers or independent contractors or jobs without benefits. I spend a lot of time talking to young people, and what I tell them is, in my experience, I've been very fortunate. I've had 2 jobs in my adult life, teaching at Brown University and then now working at the Brookings Institution. I tell young people that is not going to be their experience. They're going to have 6, 7, 8, or 9 different jobs. They're going to move across companies. They're going to move across differing sectors. We're going to see more job churn for many people in our economies. That is going to put an emphasis on portable benefits, on lifetime learning, and in my book, I argue that many countries are going to have to devote a lot of time to renegotiating the social contract. The policy piece will be absolutely crucial as we make this a transition to a digital economy. Students and young people are definitely going to need new skills. There's a famous quote from Charles Darwin when he was speaking about evolution, in which he wrote that survival is not based on being the strongest or even the most intelligent, but the most adaptable. And I think when we think about the transition to the digital world, the logic of that statement is equally true. Agility and adaptability are going to be key skills because young people are going to face a world that is far less predictable than the one that I grew up with. There's going to be more change, there's going to be more surprises, there's going to be economic disruption, there are going to be new technologies, there will be new jobs that are created. They're going to have the agility to pivot quickly. So when we're thinking about the education process, we often think about particular skills and competencies that they need, and that certainly is very important. But we also need to teach them the life skills of agility to deal with a world that is becoming far less predictable. In terms of the jobs that are probably most likely to be affected quickly, many of them, of course, are entry-level jobs. In the United States, we have 8 million retail clerks who are very much at risk. Truck driving, there are 2.5 million truck drivers, most of them with just a high school education. Autonomous vehicles are going to come quickly into that sector. We have 1 million taxi drivers, 400,000 Uber drivers, and over 300,000 Lyft drivers. So if you add all of those entry-level jobs up, that comes to almost 12 million gateway jobs. So just the impact on those entry-level people. Sometimes those people use that as a first job and then move on to some other job. What's going to happen to the economy when that first job for people of limited educations starts to disappear? But it's not just going to be the entry-level jobs that we need to think about. For example, in healthcare, AI systems are learning to read CAT scans and x-rays, and actually are achieving pretty good results. It turns out that if you feed enough images to an AI system and basically tell it this is a normal reading and this is an abnormal reading, that after a while they get it. And they're not quite as accurate as radiologists, but they're improving and they're coming pretty close at this point. When we think about how the economy is changing, e-commerce clearly is growing in importance. In the United States, 10% of retail sales right now are taking place through e-commerce, online platforms, or mobile applications. That number is likely to rise to 30% within the next decade. And so there certainly are going to be many new types of jobs created out of the emerging technologies. So we shouldn't just focus on the jobs that are going to be lost. We should also think about the jobs that are going to be created. But the challenge is going to be the mismatch hypothesis that many people may not have the skills for those new types of jobs. I've often argued, especially when I'm talking either in North America or in Europe, that if you want to see the digital future, go to Asia. I've had more than a dozen trips to China. I've also traveled to Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Malaysia. And it's amazing that in some areas they are ahead of us in this digital transformation. Certainly in terms of e-commerce and mobile payment systems. I don't think I've met any young person in China who even knows what cash is. Like, I've never seen them use cash or credit cards. It's all mobile payment systems, either Alipay or the WeChat payment system. China has already announced it's going to spend $150 billion by 2030 just on AI, with the goal of becoming the dominant power in that area. So there are many places around the world that are experimenting with new technologies, and some of them are actually further down the path than we are. Now, the good news is this is not the first time we have dealt with mega change of the sort that we're seeing right now. In the United States, 100 years ago, we had this equally fundamental shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy. And it was a very difficult, chaotic, and sometimes even violent process. You know, workers on the front lines who were attempting to unionize were getting shot and killed. It took several decades for America to work through that transition, but we made a number of both economic and political changes. We developed Social Security, unemployment insurance. We broke up some of the monopolies, particularly the railroads and in the oil sector. We added an income tax through a constitutional amendment to pay for new programs. In the political area, we doubled our electorate when women earned the right to vote in 1920. We developed primaries, direct referenda, and so on. And so I think today we're at an equally fundamental transition point as we're moving to a digital economy. We all have to start thinking big. because the problems are going to be big, they're going to be fundamental, the solutions are going to have to be equally fundamental. I think all of us have kind of grown up in this kind of post-World War II period where there was some stability in terms of geopolitics, there was some stability in terms of the role of government and the role of business, the way the economy operated. Well, those things are going to change. My last book was entitled Mega Change, and it basically said we are about to enter a period of these large-scale changes. And the Future of Work book basically tried to articulate specific things related to technology and business models. So we're going to need to think big in terms of social policy, in terms of the role that education plays. I think the biggest challenge in many countries is going to be cultural. Basically, whether the country follows personal versus social attributions of responsibility. I think in certain regards, Canada has several advantages over the United States in this regard, in the sense that Canada has a fair degree of social cohesion in its society. There's a greater sense of solidarity. You have, I believe, stronger social protections than what we have in the United States. Some of your current policies already are geared towards economic disruptions and helping workers make the transition when they are dealing with those disruptions. So I think there is a lot that the United States can learn from Canada. In the United States, the greatest risk that I see is that we may be moving into a period for the next 10, 20, and 30 years of what I like to call Trumpism on steroids, which is a term that should scare the hell out of everybody in this room. But let me explain what I mean. By Trumpism on steroids, I mean that the one thing Trump did very effectively in the 2016 presidential election was to identify the economic anxiety that is out there among the American general public. But the problem is, he didn't think big enough. Because he identified economic anxiety as arising from lost manufacturing jobs and bad trade deals. He actually underestimated the scope of the problem because the combination of the technology disruptions and the changes in business models means the impact is going to be felt on many different sectors. You know, this is not just a problem of the manufacturing sector or industries that engage in a lot of trade. Many sectors are going to be disrupted. It's going to be a gradual process. It's not like it's going to happen next year or the following year. The adoption level is going to change sector by sector and tech innovation by tech innovation. But if you add all of them together over a 10, 20, and 30-year period, the world is going to look very different 20 years from now and certainly 30 years from now. So the thing I worry the most about is that the chaos that all of you have witnessed in the United States over the last 2 years may actually continue well after Trump. Why don't I stop at this point? I'd be happy to take any questions or hear any comments that you have. And I don't know if John or Margaret are going to moderate this. But do we have any questions? Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think Darrell's done a superb job. I mean, he touched on some of the themes that we've been coming back to over the last day and evening, but also put out some big challenges about, well, how big we need to be thinking and worrying and what kind of big change we want. But I think he rounded it out, and thank you very much, because you certainly actually lifted us up from the day's discussion and then roll us into tomorrow. So that was terrific.